Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. My two co-hosts are not with me tonight, which leaves me alone with my guest, who is Matt Cota, who's the Executive Director of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. Could we reach and say hello?
Hey, Pat, how are you?
You were a repeat guest several times.
Well, I'm happy to chip in wherever I can.
Well, this blessed discussion of carbon tax, and now this year we have TCI, which, and I just explained to you before the show, I'm a little vague on all this stuff, so I figure if you can explain it to me, the viewers will be in good shape.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I can try.
Honest to God, what a time I had putting the questions together.
You did a great job.
Oh, thank you. So, could you tell us a little bit about your background and
Sure.
who you are?
Yeah, so my name is Matt Cota, and I run a nonprofit organization called the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. And we're a trade association of energy companies that are mostly in the business of delivering heating fuel, heating service. These are the men and women that both deliver the heating oil, propane, or kerosene to your home, but also go inside and fix the burner and boiler and furnace, and also the companies that provide that equipment, that manufacture that equipment, that sell that equipment in Vermont. You know, if it keeps your house warm or keeps your water hot,
Right.
most likely it was installed by someone who was trained by my team at the Vermont
great.
Fuel Dealers Association, and the fuel delivered by someone who is a VFDA member.
Excellent.
Our organization has been around since 1963, but we've been selling heating oil and kerosene in Vermont for over 100 years. In fact, my grandmother and grandfather started a company in Bellows Falls in 1941, selling then kerosene, which, you know, back then kerosene was used for cooking.
Right.
Kerosene stoves. And then that graduated to more heating oil and low sulfur heating oil and propane and wood pellets and energy services and plumbing. A lot of the companies are much like the ones that were started by my grandfather and grandmother back in 41. They're family businesses. Most of them are 10 to 12 employees, where the name on the side of the truck is usually the person driving the truck or the person in the front office you call to order the fuel from.
Well, it's in your blood.
It is.
Yes.
It is. I grew up in Windham County. I'm a seventh generation Vermonter, and I moved away for a short time, but I came back because I wanted my two children to grow up in Vermont and be close to their family.
Good for you. I've been every once in a while when the governor talks about people moving out, I said, but they always come back. Mostly. I know a couple of young couples who have kids and they wanted to come back to Vermont to raise their kids.
I can tell you my son is now 17, my daughter is 15, and it is a wonderful place to raise a family.
It is for sure. So the Fuel Dealers Association, you sort of touched on it. How many members do you have?
So we have close to 250 members, but not all of them sell fuel. Many of them provide energy services, such as you know, fixing your boilers or furnaces. We provide all the training in the state to make sure. You have to have a license in your wallet to make sure you're qualified in order to work on that combustion heating equipment, whether it's using gas or oil or wood. You know, 99% of the homes in Vermont combust something. Gas in the form of propane or natural gas, oil in terms of kerosene or heating oil, or wood as biomass or chunk wood. The very few homes actually rely on electricity for heat.
Oh yeah, that was we moved into our home. First thing we changed was the electric heat.
Yeah.
It came out like the next day when we moved in because it was expensive.
Well, yeah, it's very expensive. The old electric heaters are much like a coil that you'd see on a toaster. You know, push the toaster oven down and you see the hot coil. That's not an efficient way to distribute heat. Much more efficient way to distribute heat through a furnace, which is creating hot air that circulates throughout the home, or through a boiler, which is hot water or hydronic heating, where you're heating up a water supply and then circulating it around the house, and the heat is radiating off those hot pipes.
Nothing to do with this show, but you said something, and I can't envision it. What does the kerosene mechanism look like on a stove?
Well, of course, we don't do that anymore because it's a little bit dangerous. Yes.
Because that's what I was thinking. How do you make that safe?
Yes, those went out a long time ago.
So how did they light it?
Well, it was through a wick.
Oh, a wick. Oh, yeah, well, we have lamps like that.
We do. In fact, kerosene was originally, you know, back 150 years ago, before we had electricity, kerosene was the fuel that powered all the lights. Yeah. And then we moved on to different other methodologies. But Kerosene certainly has a long history, and we still use it. About
Yep.
10% of the oil-heated homes use kerosene. Kerosene is used because it has, not to get too much into details
okay,
as you
I'm
show,
just
but it has a
curious.
low pour point, so it can be outside and not freeze or gel up.
Oh,
It's more expensive, but for homes that don't have a basement,
yeah.
that have to have a tank outside,
Oh, right.
you want to make sure that that fuel stands up to cold weather, and that's
Right.
why kerosene is used for that
Doesn't
purpose.
explode. Because that can explode, can it not?
Well, kerosene and heating oil and diesel fuel
Not?
aren't like that at all.
Oh.
In fact, if you have I don't recommend it, but you have to heat up heating oil and kerosene to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit before it ignites. Gas, not is
Oh.
much different. Gasoline will ignite very quickly, and as will propane or natural gas. But distillate fuel is less combustible. You have to heat it up in order for it to ignite.
How do you know? I love it. You must be a hit at a party.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm real excited.
Let's talk about fuel. So last couple of times you were on is about carbon tax and our
Sure.
legislature pushing the carbon tax deal and everybody fighting no. But now we have a new thing. It's called TCI, which Transportation and Climate Initiative. And could you tell us what this is? And I don't know if it is in fact a carbon tax or something different but same results.
Yeah.
What is the TCI?
Well, as you know, I've been working in the State House the last 14 years for
Right.
the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association, and there is a alphabet soup of,
Yeah.
of names of different things, whether it's the Global Warming Solutions Act,
Oh, right.
GWSA, or the carbon tax, or the TCI. There's all sorts of initiatives. If I may, Pat, if I
Yeah,
just
please.
zoom out, like we're in a map and we're focusing on all these different issues,
Yeah.
but if you zoom out and think about what we have for an energy policy in Vermont and really throughout the Northeast, which is a policy that seeks to eliminate petroleum.
Yeah.
I mean, that is in 2011, under then Governor Shumlin, set out a comprehensive energy plan which seeks to eliminate nearly all petroleum sold in Vermont by the year 2050. So this isn't a new thing. This is
Right.
we're
Well, I
on, we're
remember
we're
discussions.
approaching the second
Right.
decade of
Right.
this energy policy. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, the plan, as has been enacted and slowly put in place, is to replace all of the electricity produced now with renewable sources. So rather than use coal or natural gas or oil to create electricity, use renewable resources such as hydropower,
Right.
wind, and solar, and biomass, which is deemed as renewable, like the McDonald generating plant in Burlington. And then after that is accomplished, in which we are on our way of doing that, then replace the fossil fuels or the petroleum used in transportation and heating, and that's all the gasoline that we use in our cars and diesel fuel in our trucks, and the heating oil, the natural gas, the propane, and the kerosene that we use for heating, and to replace it with electricity. So if you look at that big scope, how big of that is how big of a job is that? That's a fair question, right? We're going to transform our electric supply so it's all renewable, and then we're going to transfer our transportation and heating so it's all electricity. Well, if you think about the different units of measurement, so for electricity, you're talking about kilowatt hours. For natural gas, you're talking about therms. For heating oil or gasoline, you're talking about gallons. The common way to measure it is something called a BTU, or a British thermal unit.
Yeah.
If you look at all the BTUs used in transportation and in heating and for electricity, for these lights that we're experiencing right now, and you take it all and you break it into sectors, you'll find that about 85% of all BTUs consumed in Vermont on an annual basis are fossil fuels, are petroleum.
Right.
Natural gas, heating oil, propane, kerosene. So if you think about the lift or the enormous ask that this energy policy does, it's to transform 80% or more, a little bit more than 80%, into electricity. That's hard to do. You're replacing 400,000 cars that currently use combustion, gasoline and diesel fuel.
Yep.
You're replacing over 180,000 homes that use either natural gas, propane, heating oil, or kerosene. That's not something you can do in 10 years, and they haven't. So there's lots of concerns about, we haven't met our carbon reduction goals. But if you think about the cost that it would take to transform our entire energy sector, and you realize that is a big lift. It's not simply shutting down a coal plant and starting up a solar field. There's a lot more involved in that, and a lot of it is consumer choice.
Yeah.
So here we have all these different policies which get us towards this broader goal of eliminating fossil fuels in Vermont. having all of our electricity come from renewable resources, and having our transportation and heating sectors be run through electricity, electric heat, electric cars, right? So how do you accomplish that? Well, one of the ways is through something that we've talked about for several years, because we've had at least 10 different proposals over the last 6-7 years, which is a carbon tax. You increase the cost of gasoline and diesel fuel and heating oil and propane, so it's so expensive that people will be incentivized economically to buy an electric car or to reinstall that electric heat that you tore out of your home 30 years ago. So that's one way to do it, but they failed. That never even get a vote. There was 6 or 7 proposals.
People were just going crazy.
People didn't want it, so they never even voted on it. There was a study that determined, what would it cost in order to get people to switch.
Well, especially in a rural, I can't even say that word, rural area. I mean, it would cost a fortune. I think half the people in state government come from like Newport and up in the Northeast Kingdom come to work every day. Well,
that and the economists, one of the things the economists agree on is that like with anything, if we made the cost of coffee, $20 a cup, people would start drinking tea, right? So I mean, all economists agree that the carbon tax is an economic policy in order to discourage people from doing one thing, encourage people to do another. But this isn't a luxury. This is a necessity. In a cold weather state, we don't just want to be warm. We need to be warm. We don't just want to travel from Derby to Montpelier. We need to travel from Derby to Montpelier. So the idea that we're going to simply put a price function, an artificial price function, in order to encourage people to use less, well, you're also going to encourage them to do less of economic activity, meaning whatever it takes, all this energy that we need to power our economy. So the carbon tax didn't work. Then comes another thing called TCI. TCI, which you referred to, the Transportation Climate Initiative. And that's what the TCI really is a recognition that if states go it alone, there's going to be a problem, right? So if we started a carbon tax, one of the proposals was $100 per metric ton, that's about $1 a gallon. Whoa. So right now, if we had $1 a gallon on a gasoline, and you were in a gas station, in a store, along the Connecticut River, and you could skip across, consumers skip across that skinny river we call the Connecticut and get it for $1 less, that's going to happen. So there was a recognition that we kind of have to move as a region, which I agree with. If we are going to if we're going to raise the gasoline tax, for instance, to pay for our roads, let's make it a federal increase rather than a state by state. Otherwise, we're still in these competitions with one another, and we've been competing with New Hampshire and mostly losing for a long time. So the TCI is a recognition of let's not just each state do a tax, let's have a regional tax, and then let's disperse the money in an equitable way. So that's how all of the different 11, 12 northeastern states came up with the idea of creating this tax. The difference is that the TCI isn't a tax specifically on the consumer. It is a requirement that the seller of gasoline and diesel fuel, just transportation fuels, not heating, that they purchase allowances, basically the right to sell that gasoline or diesel fuel to their customer. Now, you put any cost on any business, if they don't pass it downstream, then they go out of business. So, I mean, it's reasonable to assume that any cost or allowance that they would have to purchase as part of the TCI program would be passed on to the consumer. What would that be? It's difficult to say because the allowances aren't a specific dollar amount. It's like an auction. So you would, as described by the planners of TCI, what would happen is if this were enacted, a large, someone who brings the fuel into the state and puts it into the underground storage tanks, which is then pumped to the customers, they would have to essentially get permission through these allowances in order to sell that product. And that could be, the market could fluctuate, much like the stock market could fluctuate. So what would the actual cost be on the consumer? Out of the gate, it could be as little as 5 cents, it could be as high as 25 cents, but what will it be 2, 3, 4 years down the line? It's unknown because these states all work cooperatively, would turn down essentially the amount of fuel you could sell, and then the allowances would cost more, and if states don't in fact use that money to reduce consumption in some way, then you just have an ever-increasing tax.
Now they were talking about a cap and what was the other word? Hang on a second. A cap and investment policy with the TCI.
And that's what that is. Yeah, that's exactly what that is. It's saying, okay, Vermont. So in Vermont, This is approximately, because it fluctuates year to year, but approximately we sell, the fuel suppliers sell about 300 million gallons of gasoline in Vermont every year. We also sell about 60 million gallons of diesel fuel, right, for transportation fuel. And for gasoline, there's a pathway, right? It's going to take a lot longer than some people would like, but there's a pathway to having more electric cars and fewer gasoline. The small light duty trucks and sedans, there's the Subaru that's outside, doesn't have to have a gasoline engine in it, could have an electric engine in it, and perhaps it will, and that will increase as we go along if we can get access to lithium-ion batteries and the prices can go down and it's price comparable. We absolutely can see that happen, and our gasoline gallons will go down. Not with diesel fuel. You can't move milk with electricity. You can't move lumber with electricity, and you can't move granite out of Barre with electricity. We need diesel engine tractor-trailer trucks.
For sure, right.
Yes, there's talk about, well, maybe Tesla will invent one someday, and they have a prototype. But the fact of the matter is to get that power that you need to move all that weight, you need a diesel tractor-trailer truck. So we'll be using diesel fuel for the next 50 years. Now, whether it's a blend of renewable biodiesel with that diesel fuel, but either way, you can see a pathway where we'll sell fewer gallons of gasoline. I don't see that with diesel fuel. We still need heavy-duty trucks.
So, what are your members doing with all of this? Are they able to kind of be flexible and plan ahead and know what changes they may have to make and you may have to make as an association?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well,
are they all in favor? Because the TCI, we're not sure whether we're going to be in it or out of it or what on the TCI.
Well, my members are reluctant to monetize government regulation. It's not in our DNA.
Gee, you think?
Number one. Number two, we're going to be the ones collecting it for the government. Remember, we're the taxpayers. The fuel companies that sell the fuel have
buy from you, you give it to them. Right?
Yes. Yeah. So we're
you're in a good position, sort of, right?
Well, no. I mean, the TCI we view as a very complicated version of a carbon tax.
Right.
You're creating an allowance structure, an auction structure, in which a small fuel dealer who brings in fuel from out of state is going to then have to enter in a quarterly auction with major players throughout the Northeast. Yeah, I mean, talk about a little guy getting burned. I mean, this is a classic example of where some sophisticated, capitalized companies could figure out how to work this market, but the average Joe with the name on the side of the truck driving fuel into Vermont, it's going to be tough. It's just enough to keep up with all the regulations of Vermont. Now he's going to have to play in this quarterly auction. It doesn't have to be a fuel company. It could be a hedge fund that purchases into these auction allowances. This is dangerous territory for the small business owner. Our preference is that we don't proceed with TCI because we don't view it, number one, as achieving what its end result is, which is to reduce carbon emissions. We find that the marketplace, through people making the choice to buy an electric Subaru rather than a gasoline Subaru, would do far better than this effort to create this regional tax and then distribute the money through various means.
For sure.
The compliance costs alone are going to be significant.
Right.
I mean, we have a compliance structure set up now that collects the federal excise tax and the state excise tax on gasoline and diesel fuel. That's the money that fixes our roads. $100 million a year raised when you pay at the pump. We take that money, give it to the government, and they fix our roads. About $100 million a year. That is an effective regulatory infrastructure because we've had it for a long time. This TCI, we're inventing something out of whole cloth.
Now, what is it going to be more expensive for Vermont if we don't join TCI? That the product will be more expensive if everybody, Maine, New Hampshire, all the way down to Delaware. I think that's the area. What happens to us here?
That's a great question, Pat. If we don't participate?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So the question has been posed. Well, what if we don't do it? Won't we have to pay because they'll be paying somewhere else?
Right.
And the answer, of course, is we get most of our fuel from Canada, Pat. So how do you handle that? It's coming by rail car from Canada. It's coming by truck from Canada.
Right.
That's a.
And they're not wouldn't be in the TCI.
They wouldn't be in the TCI.
Well, snooze, you lose.
But then you see this odd dynamic where if we're not in it, but New York is.
Right.
And if you're in Rutland or Bennington County, you drive to Albany to pick up
Right.
your fuel. Would you in fact be saving money to, rather than go from the little hop, skip, and a jump from Bennington to Albany,
Yeah.
to instead go to Montreal?
Right.
I mean, and what does that do for, I mean, if the arbitrage is right in the trucking costs, you have to put all those considerations into place when you think about where you pick up your fuel and who pays. But the answer to that question, though, is that probably won't happen, because that would be massive tax avoidance.
Yep.
So if we were to be part of the TCI, what would most likely happen is that the little trucker that brings the fuel in from Canada into Vermont would have to then be all of a sudden be with the big boys in New York City in this auction allowance.
Well, they might just join together and hire somebody to represent them, I would think, right? Because I don't think the small guys can.
Well, of
Can
course,
survive,
of course,
right?
you'd have to worry about Sherman antitrust laws and all those sorts of things. So it's a complicated regional carbon tax that may not pay very many dividends to Vermont, and may not pay any dividends when it comes to climate. I mean, if you look at the models that are shown in the TCI, I mean, with the do-nothing approach is still going to see a reduction in emissions as electric cars become more
Right,
affordable,
for sure,
as the
for
charging
sure.
infrastructure becomes more
Right.
readily available, and as people make both an economic and environmental decision that
Right.
says, no, I'd rather drive electric. Now, some people won't be able to make that choice. For instance, people that have to drive long distances that don't have access to charging, or you're not your regular commuters.
Yeah.
My wife, who goes from her house to her job as a teacher, 8 miles a
Right,
day.
exactly.
I mean, she might be a qualified candidate for electric car. But myself, who travels all around the state and all around the region all the time, there's no way I could do it even if I wanted to.
Right.
Same thing with that milk hauler. That milk hauler cannot drive an electric Prius. Prius is not making a
Oh,
tractor
because of the
trailer
weight.
truck. You need in order to
Right.
drive. So that was one of our concerns right off, which is I see you're putting this price mechanism to convince people to drive electric. Higher price for gasoline, incentives for electric cars. You're going to make an economic decision and perhaps an environmental one at the same time. A milk hauler cannot make a environmental decision. He can't make the economic decision. All they can do is pay more. Same with the wood products industry. Same with the granite industry, which are very important to our economy,
Right,
as
for
you
sure.
know. And the idea that we're going to increase the tax on the diesel fuel they need to make our forest products, our milk, and
Right,
our granite
right.
industry, and other industries that
Right.
need heavy-duty vehicles, you just can't buy an electric tractor-trailer truck.
So when is this thing supposed to be in play, and it's not going to come to fruition in 2021? They must be looking out a few years to make this all happen.
No, 2021 is the goal. The goal is
Is it really?
It's the second iteration of the MOU should come in
Wow.
April, and then they'll ask the states whether they want to still participate. New Hampshire has certainly indicated
Yeah,
that they're out.
they're out.
Vermont is on the fence right now. Other states are in. But there's other methods that may gain. It's been a lot of work. I recognize that people have put in a lot of work into this study. Peter Walk, our former
right.
Deputy Secretary of Energy
Right,
and Natural
right.
Resources, now the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, he has put in untold hours
Really,
of work on
really.
this process, and he understands it very well, as have other members of the administration.
I actually read the MOU and its addendum.
Well,
which
you
is-
put in untold work here, haven't you?
I feel like I need a life. This is very, for me, maybe not for you, but it's very complicated. Seriously, the addendums are worse than the MOU I got, but then it was like 10 pages of addendum.
Yeah.
It's like, good grief.
Well, yeah, well, a lot of the discussion has been, okay, how do we create this regional body that can assess this? How do we regulate it? How do we make sure we're collecting the money? And then the other half of the conversation, which is probably the more fun conversation for other
Right.
people other than the taxpayers,
Right.
which is how do you spend the money? And for cities, I think the answer is obvious. They've got a public transit infrastructure
Right.
that they need to bolster, so people will stop driving their car from Natick to Boston, and they'll
Right.
tap on the bus or the T. We have a problem, right?
Yes,
We're
we
a
do.
rural state.
Right.
We're not going to create a bus service for 3 people to
Right.
get to Montpelier.
Right.
So, in many ways, the rural economy doesn't benefit from this. I mean, there are ways certainly to provide a public transit in a rural state, but generally speaking, it's very
It'd
expensive.
have to be underwritten by the state, wouldn't
Yeah.
it? Because you couldn't do it
Yeah.
by profit.
No.
So speaking of initials and stuff, I read about the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. How does that fit in with all of our discussion?
So you're talking about the Global Warming Solutions Act or the Regional Greenhouse Gas
Regional
Initiative?
Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI.
Right. So RGGI, as it's often called, or Regional
That
Greenhouse
makes
Gas
sense.
Initiative,
Right.
That's in place, and that's essentially what the TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, is modeled on. So the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been paying dividends to Vermont.
And it's been in place a while,
yes,
hasn't it? Yeah.
15 years, I guess
Yeah.
now.
Right.
What it's done is it said to power producers, so if you want to create an electron, put it on the grid, and consume it in the RGGI territory, which is largely the TCI territory, New England and some of the Northeast states,
Right.
that if you create that electron through a fossil fuel like coal or oil or natural
Right.
gas, then you pay, you have to purchase an allowance in order to create an electron from a fossil fuel. If you don't create, that's incentivizing the power producers to not use coal, not use natural gas, not use oil, and instead use wind and solar
Right.
and hydro. And that has had an effect. So states like Vermont that have had access to hydropower have been able to benefit from RGGI economically. And that money that is currently raised in the RGGI auction is then distributed depending. So states that rely on coal, they're a payer, they're a sender, as we call it. Vermont, which doesn't rely on coal at all, is a taker, and that money is then distributed to Efficiency Vermont, which then uses it for weatherization.
We would spend most of that money on weatherization. I don't know whether there's other things to do to impact the carbon footprint than weatherization.
Yeah, weatherization is just a way of being more efficient, and efficiency, we always say,
Right.
rather than replace your entire system, make your house more efficient.
Right.
It makes sense. If
Yeah.
the cost of replacing a heating system is not insignificant.
I know I've been waiting for them to tell me what kind of furnace to burn wood on, because that's coming, right?
So yes,
It is.
There's lots of different choices you can
Yeah.
make when you want to decide how to heat your home. You can have a boiler,
Yep.
which heats water, radiates heat. You can have a furnace, which blows hot air, and you can use coal. You can still use coal. Some
Right,
people.
yep,
You can
yeah.
use propane. You use kerosene. You can use natural gas. You can use heating oil. You can use wood. You can use chunk wood, or you can
Yeah.
use biomass,
Right.
and you can use electricity. So as a consumer, you have a choice, but the idea behind the efficiency of weatherization is that if you are going to change over any system, and if its useful life is not over, if it still works,
Right.
you're much better off putting your funds into something that is going to reduce your consumption rather than replace. Be more efficient. Don't convert.
Listen, I am so old. We had coal delivered in the basement.
Sure.
We had a chute with different stalls,
Yep.
and it came in. And when it came in, the entire house was you choked to death for a day or two because
Yeah.
it just rose right
Yeah.
upstairs.
Yeah.
It was fun. We got a big kick out of it as kids. Coal trucks here. This is cool.
And that's the way some of our members are delivering pellets.
Yeah. Right.
Using trucks
Wood pellets.
that lift up, through a pneumatic lift, and then push
Right
the pellets just like
Right.
they used to do, in the 1940s with the
Yeah.
1950s with
Yep.
coal.
That's what we did. There was a couple of years ago. I'm sure they've solved the problem with lack of pellets. Not enough pellets. Have they fixed that? The pellets are there for however you want to use them.
Yeah. So pellets, again, a lot of our members sell pellets. A lot
Right.
of people choose to sell pellets there. When you have a stove, they're real easy. Like a parlor stove,
Yep.
you just take a bag, you put it
And
in.
put it, right.
There's also more expensive pellet systems. There's a company here in Barrie that makes them that are
Yep.
automatic feeders with big bins. The problem with pellets is that they take a lot of energy to create.
Oh.
It's not like chunk wood where the energy to create.
It's all pressed, isn't it?
It's
Is that
all
what it
it's
is?
all
Yeah.
pressed. So it takes a
Right.
tremendous amount of energy, and
Right.
energy is expensive. Electricity is expensive in Vermont and other places in the Northeast. And pellets, they degrade, right? So so you could go into your old basement, you could take out a coal that was dropped there 60 years ago, and
It's still there?
it's still gonna burn.
I'm sure.
Pellets will degrade. If they get moisture in them, they turn into junk. They separate in something called the fines,
Right.
which they just sort of split, and they lose their BTU value, their heat value. So the pellets that have been sitting on a wet sidewalk for the past 2 years,
Yeah. All moldy.
you're not going to get much BTU value out of
Right.
them. So So it's one of those on just-in-time type of manufacturing processes.
Yeah.
You don't want to create a stockpile of pellets and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
let them literally rot on the vine. Well, not on the vine, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure.
You can't
Right.
have them. So that's the problem with pellet manufacturing. It costs a lot, and you don't know what the demand is going to be. When is demand high?
Yeah.
When oil prices are high.
Yeah.
Right? Because you can always tell when you just drive around rural Vermont, and the higher the wood stacks are in the fall, you know that the oil prices are higher. The lower they are, they're lower.
Interesting.
People have been heating with oil for 100 years because it works.
Yeah, right.
It works, and you don't have the soot, you don't have the particulate matter. But Vermonters are very frugal,
Yes.
and where they can, they will save themselves some money, but with a
I
little
love
hard
burning
work.
wood. I mean, Bruce does it. I don't do it. But I just love the smell in the morning, waking up, goes right up the stairs. It's great. So here's something I saw. See, I don't know how these all fit in, but there's a word called pollution allowance.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that fit in? If we are polluting, we have to pay, we get penalized? I don't like this. I don't understand it.
Yeah,
anyway.
the pollution allowance
Yeah.
is another word for saying a tax or a cap.
Okay.
So it's a
At least
it's-
they're being imaginative.
yes,
instead of calling it a tax.
it's a more less
That's right.
distasteful word than tax.
Yes. Well, we'll spread that around.
But what's also happening in the legislature is something called the Global Warming Solutions Act,
Right,
which is
right.
a key part about this energy portfolio. Remember, I talked about this. We're now on year
Yep.
10
Yep.
or year 9, almost on our second decade of creating a policy which seeks to eliminate
Yeah.
petroleum, to increase electricity that's created by renewable energy, and use that electricity for both heating and transportation.
Yeah.
That's what's been happening for the last 10 years. What is the plan for the next 30 years is
Right.
to continue on that path unless something changes. And part and parcel of that is something called the Global Warming Solutions Act, which passed by the House.
That's H688, right? Is
Yes,
that the number?
105 representatives, majority,
Yeah.
no more than a majority, a
Yeah.
veto-proof majority, passed the Global Warming Solutions Act. It now goes to the Senate tomorrow,
Right,
or
right.
whenever people hear this in March, where they'll have to deliberate on it. And it does a couple of things. The first thing it does is it takes our goals of reducing carbon emissions, which have been goals
right.
that have been in place for a long time,
Yep.
and gives them the force of law. Now, what does that mean by that? What it does is it creates this committee called the Climate Action Council, of which one fuel dealer is on and 21 others. And they're supposed to come up with, over the next 18 months, and at a cost of about $1 million, come up with a plan on how to meet those goals. So it's overseen by the Agency of Natural Resources. It's 22 individuals, including one fuel supplier. Which should probably
Repeat
be
that
me.
again.
It'll probably be me. One. And they're supposed to come up with a concrete action plan for reducing carbon emissions. Now, what happens after they come up with a plan? I've been on lots of these task forces. I've been on lots
22
of
people is
councils.
a lot to bring together, too.
But once they agree on something, then they don't usually, because I've been on Governor Shumlin's Thermal Efficiency Task Force. I've been on Governor Scott's Climate Action Council. I've participated in a number of different fact-finding
Right.
committees and all sorts of things, because they want to hear from the people that supply the energy,
Right.
and that's usually me. And one of the things that'll happen, though, what's different about this time, is rather than presenting their findings in the legislature going, oh, that's very nice, we'll take that under consideration. What the Global Warming Solutions Act is, it creates a process to enact whatever that 22-person Climate Action Council does into law through something that I won't go into, but familiar with, the LCAR process, the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules.
Right.
So rather than go through the legislature, pass the House, pass the Senate, approved by the governor, what this does is it's the easy pass, it's the quick lane to enactment, in which the 22-member panel comes up with the idea, shows it to LCAR, the small group of
Right.
legislators go,
Right.
yep, that sounds fine, bam, it's done. Now, say it doesn't work. Say these
That's what's
22
in my head at the moment.
Say these
Right.
22 minds can't figure it out, or they figure it out, or they can't agree, or they figure it out and they enact it, but it doesn't work. And in 2026, that we don't meet our, just 5 years, we don't meet our emission reduction goals. What
And
happens then?
Where in the, you can sue the state. I read, is this the bill that you can sue the state?
Exactly. So
That is just wrong.
So what happens is, if this 22-member super committee,
Yeah,
again, me and 21 others, can't come up with a way to reduce carbon emissions by the state-mandated goals, then any individual or entity in or outside of Vermont
right.
can sue the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources and get paid back court costs and attorney fees in order to enact that. So for instance, say the Climate Action Council came up with 4 ideas and really only enacted one of them.
Right.
You know, they could sue them and say, well, if you acted those other 3, then we might be somewhere.
Are you suing because you got personally impacted, or because Vermont got personally impacted because this initiative didn't meet the goals? I mean,
Either or, yes.
I'm sorry. That is really stupid.
Well, there's 2 things that we complained about. I won't call it stupid, but there are two things that we disagree with. One is that you are essentially ceding the authority of the legislature to the executive branch.
Right.
Right. So if you're a lawmaker and you just give this, you just task this 22-member panel with the ability to come up with an answer to all of our climate problems,
Yep.
You are basically giving away that authority to that panel and the Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, who's under the control, who's been appointed by, serves at the pleasure of the governor.
This is almost bad as Act 46 when you have non-elected people appointed to make all these rules and regs. Isn't that, they're not elected, these people, they're just appointed, right?
Right. Okay, so that number 1, the legislature is ceding some of its authority.
Yeah.
Number 2, the legislature is setting a process up where failure almost guarantees a costly lawsuit, right? So, let's imagine 5 years from now. Okay, the Climate Action Commission comes up with some ideas. They enact those ideas. We still fail to meet those climate emission goals. Maybe because a very large company that uses a lot of energy decided to move to Bradford or Montpelier.
Right.
Maybe because, for whatever reason, we increased our population and with that brought more homes and more cars.
Right.
Doesn't matter.
Right.
It's a baseline number. It's not a percentage of consumption based on population or housing stock. So it almost urges us to have a no-growth policy, both from a business point of view and a residential point of view, because if you're going to get sued, if you add more homes and more cars to our roads, then you're incentivized to discourage business development, right? So number 1. Number 2, if you're creating a methodology for people to get sued, you are going to take swift and decisive action. Now that swift and decisive action, that's a phraseology used by the Climate Caucus, which is to say, you need to work so fast that we have to bypass the normal legislative process, form this super committee of 22 people, enact something quickly through the Legislative Council through the next 18 months, spend $1 million making sure that they get the resources in order to get it done, and be under the pressure to actually not only enact the plan, but see the reduction in carbon emissions in order to not face a costly lawsuit. What is swift and decisive action that will achieve that? Well, I'll give you one. Ban combustion. Ban oil heat.
I'm sorry, my blood is so boiling at the moment.
So if you are part of
really
if you're part of this committee and you're looking at, if we don't reduce emissions, we are going to be sued.
Right.
What methodology could we do? What could we enact right away without bothering with the legislature?
Right.
Because we don't need to.
Right.
What could we do? We could stop delivering the 15 million gallons of heating oil that we deliver to low-income Vermonters every year at the request of the government. We get paid to deliver to low-income Vermonters.
Right.
They don't have to do that. That's swift and decisive action. You could say, if you're a low-income Vermonter, you either heat with wood or you don't heat.
Right.
But they're not going to do that.
No, of course not.
Because that would be cruel.
Yeah, right.
They could say any new construction, as they've done in Berkeley, California, as they've done in Brookline, Mass., as they're doing in Arlington, Mass., they could say any new construction or residential development or business, if you want to build here, in order to pull a building permit, you have to prove that you're not using fossil fuels for heating. Well, what does that do to the cost of a new home or the cost of a new business?
Right.
It raises it significantly.
Sure.
Raises it significantly.
So when you sue, you get money back, which of course would be my tax money going to pay off the settlement.
The lawyers have billable hours, so they'll
But you
get paid.
can't make this committee do anything. You just take money from them.
Well, if the committee sits on their hands and doesn't do any work, then they could be sued. If the committee does the work but doesn't achieve the end result, they could be sued. So there's a lot of pressure on those 22 members in order to come up with a plan that works. And my concern is not that the 22 members can't come up with good ideas and to reduce carbon. I know they can.
Right.
the problem I have is, under the threat of lawsuit, what will be swift and decisive action? And it could be to limit the ability for people to heat their homes with fossil fuels through either a ban on combustion,
Right.
or to purchase a vehicle that uses gasoline or diesel fuel through other types of. Now, what they can't do, which we clarified, what they can't do, the super committee,
Yeah.
is they can't create a new tax. Any tax has to go before the
You just
legislature.
sue.
And if they tried, there would
Right.
be a lawsuit from the other side saying the legislature did not cede its authority to tax
Right.
to the super entity. So there would be a lawsuit on the other side. I imagine there would be.
This is opening up Pandora's box so wide.
It's a jobs bill for lawyers.
But it could be applied to anything. I mean, once you've done it here to allow people to sue the state, you could just put it on any bill. If they don't do it, sue the state. You need to get board and commission insurance for this super committee you're talking about. Make sure you get that.
Well, I might be off the committee now.
Just
No.
say you want boards and commission funding. That's it,
The
insurance.
the big idea
Yeah.
is we've got these goals that haven't been met. Now, are the goals appropriate? Are the goals arbitrary? Are the goals necessary?
Right.
That's another discussion, right? But under the law, or under the bill, which may become law, it says the goals have to be met. There is no excuse. And not meeting the goals, meaning the state is opening up for lawsuits, inspiring this 22-member panel to take swift and decisive action. Swift and
Right.
decisive action, which frankly may be politically unpopular.
Right. Well,
If-
especially if they're hitting up low-income people, that's
If
for
we were
sure
to create a
unpopular.
vote today that said, would you ban the installation of oil or gas
Right.
burners, a natural gas or propane burner or an oil burner, if you wanted to renovate your home, and in order to renovate your home, you couldn't purchase a oil or gas-fired boiler,
Right.
you'd have to use either wood or electricity. Would the legislature vote for that today? I don't think so.
Right.
But they may not have a choice, because if the super committee agrees that that's the best way that we can reduce emissions, and LCAR stamps a signal of approval, the governor or the legislature will never get a chance to weigh in.
Were you testifying a lot on this bill
Mm-hmm.
and saying stop or no or something? I mean,
Yeah.
I am falling asleep at the wheel. I'm going to get active on this. It's over in the Senate now?
It's over in the Senate now. So it
Okay.
merged out of the House Energy Committee by a vote of
Yep.
7-3.
Because
so
Patty McCoy, who's head of the House Republicans minority group, she's written a pretty scathing memo about we don't need this, stop it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and the concerns are, and Representative Sherman from Stowe, had the right approach, I think, when she brought up, and she was a no vote, which she said, why are we ceding our authority as a legislature? And the answer, to be fair to Chairman Briglin, was we don't have that much time, so we can't wait for this committee to come back with a buffet of options for us to choose from. We just want to empower this committee to proposal and get the wheels in motion as fast as possible,
Right.
because the men and women that fear what's happening,
the global warming,
their biggest concern is that things are moving too slow. And in fact, we're seeing it in local towns, in cities. Climate activists have
Right.
almost given up on the federal government doing anything.
Right.
Some are disappointed in what we've seen in the protests in the State House about what's
Right.
happening in Montpelier.
Right.
So we're seeing energy committees in different towns proposing different proposals for reducing carbon emissions, which inevitably have something to do with reducing the ability of a consumer to choose combustion, whether it's a gasoline-powered car or an oil or gas burner to heat their home. Our real concern is that we are limiting our options, and you are increasing the costs. You are incentivizing us to not build, to not expand, because if we're so focused on reducing emissions, why would you ever allow a new residential development to take place?
Right.
Why would you want to attract businesses? If attracting businesses only increases their energy use, thus your carbon emissions, it's a perverse incentive to slowly shrink. And we don't want to do that in Vermont. We want to grow. We want to be more welcoming.
Yeah.
We want more people to move to
Right,
Vermont.
exactly.
We want to build smartly. We want to fill. I grew up in a mill town 75 years after the mills closed in Bells Falls, Vermont.
Oh, not many people, right? Is it-
We don't want
Right.
to lose population in
Right.
some of these critical areas of our state,
Yeah.
which had thrived in years past. We want to bring them to our towns. Chittenden County will do just fine. We want to make sure the 13 other
Right,
counties
right.
can survive, and in order to do that, we don't increase the cost of creating a business or building a home here.
Don't you think some of it is, I think most everybody understands global warming and maybe accepts it, but they don't accept the urgency, because in Vermont, if we stood on our heads and did everything right, it would move the needle about, I don't know, point something one. I mean,
Well, not
we
even,
don't
yeah.
have an impact on anything. So we have this urgency to do this stuff, and to what end? Just to show people that it can be done so we can lead the pack? It's Vermont. I'm sorry, be quiet. Okay, I'll ask another question. Oh, I'm going to write about this. And so Governor Sununu's out, and
Back to the TCI.
I'm sorry, it was just TCI. He's out, and is Phil? Excuse me. Where's our governor? Is he in, out, in?
I haven't had a conversation with the governor about it. I think his staff has put in, a great effort to understand the issue, understand the implications,
Right.
to study it. He's got a great staff. I don't think any decision has been made.
Yeah, they're very bright folks.
Yeah,
and
they are. The
stuff.
concern is, of course, what impact this will have on our rural economy.
And did they mention? My voice is going. Have they mentioned rail at all in this discussion of moving? Because I was thinking of the Rock of Ages and stuff. They use rail a lot to move the heavy slates
Yeah.
of granite.
Yeah.
Now, have they talked about rail here in Vermont and transportation?
Well, rail is a big user of diesel fuel, of course,
Right.
because that's what
Right.
powers the
Yeah, right.
engines. And
That wouldn't help them.
and rail is a very efficient way. It's how we move most of our fuel, our propane, our heating oil,
Right.
our gasoline. It is tremendously efficient from an energy standpoint.
Right.
You need less power, less diesel fuel to move a rail car, and a
Right.
single rail car can hold 20,000 gallons of heating oil, whereas a one truck can only hold 9,000 gallons. So, and rail cars come in a string of 10 to 20.
Right.
So rail is integral part to our energy supply system.
We haven't put much money in it over the years, because I think we can go 35 miles an hour max on our rail system. So that has to be upgraded, because you can't run a railroad on 35 miles an hour. You won't get too many
Well, you
places.
can move freight though.
Well, you can,
You can
but
move
slowly,
freight.
very slowly, very slowly. So, I wanted to talk about this. This is killing me.
Sure.
The MOU. So is that something we're supposed to sign if we want to be in the TCI?
Well, not you and me.
No, not me. I would say no.
Yeah, so
there's too many whereases and notwithstanding.
The
in here.
memorandum of understanding, or the MOU, as is
Yeah.
recalled, is basically everyone putting their chips on the table and saying they're anteing up and saying I'm in. So that's going to come
For what price?
for the TCI.
Is there money involved in here to ante up?
Well, there is your commitment that you are going to participate and subject the fuel sold in your state to this allowance structure.
So there's big bucks involved here.
Well, there's certainly some administrative work that's involved in ensuring that
Yeah,
there's
who's going to
compliance.
oversee this for however many states? There's got to be a TCI in the sky.
Yeah,
that's
there'll
gonna,
be a TCI Inc. or something that administers the allowances, that makes sure everyone is playing fair. If this is enacted,
right.
and we've talked about this. If this happens, despite all the concerns,
Right.
one of the most important things from our perspective is that it is applied fairly, and that there isn't anyone not paying. Make sure everyone is in. We don't want it to be a selective enforcement situation. Same thing
Yeah.
with taxes. If you found someone that was not paying the
Delinquent, right.
excise tax
Right.
to the state of Vermont, if you were paying it, you would feel that there should be a level of enforcement to ensure that everyone pays their fair share.
This whereas is quite a dandy. Whereas continued collaboration on clean transportation strategies, including regional electric vehicle charging infrastructure, improved multimodal transit infrastructure, more sustainable freight movement,
Yeah.
And support for lower carbon fuels will provide greater economic, social, and public health benefits to residents and communities across the region than if each jurisdiction acted alone. Isn't that special? That's a lot of commitment.
Yeah. And it means something different for folks in Boston versus
sure.
folks in Newport
Right.
or New Jersey. If you're Jersey City or you're talking about New York or
Right.
I mean their ideas of how to deploy these resources will be up to individual state. In fact, up to the legislature. The idea is if we have 25, 30, $50 million coming our way,
Yeah.
the legislature will get to decide. Now they could decide to spend it on fixing the roads. Or they could decide to spend it on bus service to rural communities, or they
Right.
could decide on bike paths in downtown Burlington, or they could think of using it to build out electric car infrastructure at charging stations
Right.
at places where there's not coverage. All of these things are being discussed, and I wear many different hats in the industry, in the energy industry, but from a perspective of the convenience stores, the retailers that provide gas and diesel fuel, I mean, they still have a pretty important asset, right? They have some of the best corners in Vermont, and most of them are convenience stores.
Right.
Gone are the days where you would come in a mechanic shop and a filling station. Now they're
Right.
convenience stores,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
And they're in prime pieces of real estate in each individual towns.
Yeah.
And the two services complement one another. You go in and you get something at the convenience store, and then you fill up your car.
Right.
What happens if the gasoline sales go down? Well, I can tell you it's already happening. In the rural areas of the state, we're going to have energy deserts, where much like we have food deserts in places where where you have to drive miles to get to a supermarket.
Right.
If you don't have the volume of gasoline,
Right.
it's hard to then supplement your store side, right? So you end up in a situation where in rural areas, it becomes very difficult to make that model economically sustainable. So, we're trying to help those convenience store stations, to recognize where there is the ability to get in charging stations. Where there's not, you have to have a certain access to phase 3 power, and some simply don't have them. But the reality is you're not seeing more gasoline stations built in Vermont. You're seeing we're losing stations every year, just like we're losing dairy farms. And if you live in Chittenden County, you might not notice it because we already have quite a few. But if you live in a rural area of the state and that mom and pop grocery store that has been around for a long time all of a sudden can't sell gas anymore because of low volumes, and they can't sell much milk anymore either, or any gifts because everyone's ordering online, well, you lose something, right?
Sad,
You lose something when you lose our local mom and pop grocery stores and convenience
gossip.
stores.
Where do you get the gossip?
Where do you get the gossip? Oh, Facebook.
Facebook. You can't trust
No,
that
you
Facebook.
can't.
I was just looking at this when we were talking about the MOU and the appendix or the addendum is just like the rulemaking process. This is what's in the addendums are all the rules. Like when you'd go before the Legislative Council for rulemaking,
Yep.
there's a lot of rules.
Yes,
I
there are.
particularly like this stuff about the auction. Is it a physical standing in a room with people raising their hand and saying 250?
No,
Or is
I
it-
suspect it will be, it hasn't been designed yet, but I suspect it will be an online auction.
Online auction.
And done quarterly. So if I'm a fuel supplier and I sell X amount of gallons, I'll know I have to purchase Y amount of allowances through the auction. And if I buy it on day 1, well, maybe it's one price. If I buy it on day 45, it's another price. If I buy it on day 90, it may be another price entirely. And a little bit of that is like, when did you buy your stock of GE, or whatever,
Exactly.
I mean, if you bought it at the wrong time, sometimes it's just bad luck.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's just good luck, and it had nothing to do with skill or your ability to manipulate or to work with the markets in order to get the best price at that time. Or you may wait too late, and then all of a sudden you say, I'm not going to worry about it now, I'll worry about it on day 90, and then all of a sudden all the allowances have been purchased, and then they're reselling those allowances at a higher price.
Sure.
It becomes a sophisticated game for sophisticated financial players. And we're really good at keeping your house warm. We're really good at keeping your car running. We're really good at getting the fuel in very cold weather to where it needs to go and keeping energy. But man, oh man, I worry about us trying to get into some quarterly auctions with the three-piece suits in New York City and try to compete with them. I'm not sure our Vermont fuel dealers are gonna survive. as well in that cutthroat market.
So what would you like, in the time left, what would you like to see us do going forward besides scrap this? Can I put words in your mouth? Well, seriously, I mean, there's obviously people are thinking, well, there's a problem coming. We need to do something about the environment and et cetera. What would you like to see going forward? What's the solution from your perspective?
Well, there's no question that there's a lot of energy, no pun intended, around reducing energy and using more renewable energy, and we're seeing that.
Right.
The same men and women that install the gas and oil boiler in your home that keeps you warm also install the electric coal climate heat pump that can keep you warm. They also install wood pellet stoves, right? The enemy is not your neighbor fuel dealer. Again, the guy or the woman with a name on the side of the truck that's lived in your community for the last 100 years, that participates in the local Rotary and church and Little League and all that stuff. They don't own an oil well. They provide a service. That service is providing energy. That service is providing warmth. That service is providing transportation fuel. So number one, recognizing that we can be a resource in this, that we're not someone that they should be protesting against, that we're somebody should be working with, because what we can do is install equipment that uses renewable energy. We can sell renewable energy in the form of biodiesel or biomass. And frankly, if we are going to transition to electric vehicles, we're going to need those corner stores to be also selling electricity for cars.
Right.
So, I push back on some of my friends in the environmental movement that sort of view us as the problem. And I say, no, we're not the problem, we're the solution. We now provide over 80% of the energy in Vermont. We deliver a liquid product that's packed with energy, with BTUs, that works. It's worked for 100 years. If we are going to transition, you're not going to transition like that to electricity. It's going to be a process, and it may be longer than you want. But understand that we are going to be part of that transition. We are going to deliver renewable fuels. We're going to install more efficient equipment. We are going to help people that are using electric vehicles through charging stations. And there has to be some buy-in from the business. If all we're doing is charging our cars, heating our homes, and lighting our homes, with one company and sending that away to one company, that we lose something here. You wouldn't put all of your money into one stock. You would have a diversified portfolio.
These days you have to.
These days you have to. The same is true with energy.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that we have a diverse source of energy that will sustain us. Just like the farmer with the high wood pile when the oil prices are high and the lower wood pile when it's low. We need to be diversified. And that's part of my job or my goal for my members is to say you can't just sell one product, you've got to sell many of them, and you need to diversify into renewables and to energy efficiency.
Good for you. What's the mileage for an electric car? Where do you have to go from one charging station to another? Do you know any idea how much long that is?
It varies depending on the car, depending on the high level versus low level, but.
And does it change the colder it is, the less mileage you get?
just like your phone, it's a lithium-ion battery. So the colder it is, the more the longer you have to recharge it at more frequency than you would if it were.
But what's sort of normal? How many miles do you think?
Well, I mean, you can get if your commute is 30 miles a day,
you could get there.
It's not a problem. But if you do road trips, I certainly know people that want an electric car because of the environmental impact. And but many of them also, I know have a gas counterpart as a second car.
They have those hybrids too that switch over from one to the other.
The hybrids as
I would feel comfortable with that one, I think. Plus, they're all this. If you get in an accident, the firemen need to know it's electric because it doesn't do well if you put water on it, because the firemen could get hurt.
Right.
I don't know how they do that, but anyway.
Yeah,
you got me so worked up. So you will hear from me on this issue. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate it.
Really.
Anytime.
Excellent. Thank you for tuning in. If you're just as angry as me, let me know. We'll see you next week. And in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.